Take a moment and think about the last time you lied. Was it for the right reasons? A lot of us can think of good reasons not to tell the truth. Maybe it's to avoid hurting someone's feelings or to protect ourselves. But to Dostoyevsky, every lie we tell paves the pathway to hell. He emphatically believed that dishonesty pulls us away from the capacity to love this life. In fact, he went on to predict the downfall of civilizations and religious institutions on the basis of having good reasons to lie. And I think he makes a pretty compelling point. So my goal for this video is to convince you never to lie again. And I'm mainly going to be arguing that you should never lie to yourself. This isn't about being blunt to others. It's about cementing truthfulness as an unshakable principle, as something you don't do out of reason but out of faith. I'd love for you to walk away from this video feeling like you can tell the truth even if your voice shakes. And in order to do this, I want to present these lessons just as powerfully as they were presented to me, which was through the book The Brothers Karamazov. And so there are going to be spoilers ahead. But I'd hope that this doesn't discourage you from reading the book, but rather gives you even more reason to dive into it. This is one of those texts that teaches you the few things that matter more than anything else, so I highly recommend everybody go through it. That said, spoilers ahead. And I hope you won't mind if I take my time here, because although I could summarize all these lessons in a few seconds, then they'd be forgotten just as quickly. I'd rather walk you through the stories, the characters, and the conflicts that make these lessons really sink into the bones. So let's begin. I'm going to start off by detailing the worldview that Dostoyevsky holds, one that turns truth into a divine and holy thing. Then, we're going to talk about the hidden force that makes being honest impossible, shame, and how to overcome it. And then we are diving into crises. We're going to explore how these pretty ideals stand up against a murder, a court trial, and the deepest pits of existential horror and frustration. Let's dive in. First of all, Dostoyevsky actually believed there could be paradise on this earth, and he gave us a formula for it. This is already a pretty shocking place to begin with, as given how chaotic and cynical so much of the modern world is right now, a lot of people see utopianism as just naively optimistic. But that makes this point even more exciting to me. He thinks that heaven on earth would be possible if everybody came to realize that they were responsible for everyone else. If every person on this earth came to understand that they truly are each other's brothers and sisters. But feeling this way requires coming to know about the divinity of all peoples, not abstractly but as a lived truth. And to do that, you have to learn to love everybody. And in order to learn to love everybody, we have to first learn to love ourselves. Dostoyevsky says that the inability to accept others fundamentally stems from the inability to accept ourselves. And in order to learn to accept ourselves, we have to be able to see things clearly and act in good conscience. And here's where truth is paramount. Telling lies erodes the possibility of all of this, because it prevents you from seeing clearly, thus prevents you from accepting yourself, and thus prevents you from loving and accepting others. Hopefully you can see how this is like a pyramid with truth at the bottom. In this model, truth is imbued with a divine kind of importance. It is a necessary step on the pathway to heaven. Now let's pause here for a second, because I want to share a big debate I had while I was making this video, which is whether or not I should include all these religious ideas, since I know it might turn off a lot of modern listeners. In the end, I decided it's impossible to really engage with Dostoyevsky's thinking without taking his religious ideas seriously. This is a guy who begged to hear the parable of the prodigal son on his deathbed. But I think that even if you're purely secular, think about what his worldview does symbolically. Dostoyevsky establishes a world where telling the truth gains an immortal moral value. It's a world where every action you take matters, which is kind of true even if you don't actually believe in God, heaven, or anything like that. And just for a moment, imagine believing that paradise was really possible and that you telling the truth was a necessary part of that picture. How might that change the way you act towards yourself and others? Not as some far-off fantasy, but as a possibility within your lifetime. That is what Dostoyevsky asks us to do. Well, alright Dostoyevsky, if truth is so important, then why don't we all just tell the truth? The answer... Quote, "Do not be ashamed of yourself. for that is the cause of everything. The chief difficulty in telling the truth lies in exposing yourself. By doing so, you're gonna have to face all of your insufficiencies in the clear light of day. And it is painfully difficult to know our own flaws. Our instincts are to retreat, to hide, and to mask. But Dostoyevsky suggests this sense of protection is an illusion, and that the shame we avoid in the moment builds up into something far more dangerous, something that destroys our capacity to attain paradise and our ability to love this life here on Earth. Now, you might have noticed that we've set up a dichotomy here, with truth on one hand and lies on the other. Dichotomies are a great way to understand Dostoyevsky, and to my mind, the most relevant one is between love and fear. Everything that we do is either an act of love or an act of fear. A theme in Dostoyevsky's work is that all things, no matter how complex, ultimately boil down to this simple distinction between the love choice and the fear choice. If you can know the truth of this, you will never be lost. And Dostoyevsky loves to represent these dichotomies through people. One example of this is with Fyodor Pavlovich. Fyodor is the father of the brothers in the Brothers Karamazov, and he is an example we're given of a life lived from fear. Fyodor is a terrible father. He abandons his own children and is mostly concerned with alcohol, maidens, and money. He manipulates his own children, attempts to seduce away his son's own lover, and is just generally not a good guy. Contrasting the belligerent Fyodor, there is Father Zosima. Father Zosima is also a father, but he is a superior one. He's a spiritual leader who helps people selflessly. It is he who said, "Do not be ashamed of yourself, for that is the cause of everything." Father Zosima dies nobly and beloved, whereas Fyodor is murdered by his own children. Zosima is the love choice. Fyodor is the fear choice. These are two obvious examples. When you read the book, Fyodor is like a clown, constantly taking offense at everything. But we're also given examples of how subtle and pernicious shame can be, and how quietly lies can slip into our lives and begin to erode them, seemingly without our knowledge. And we're shown all of this through Ivan Fyodorovich. Ivan is the second son of Fyodor. He is a modern man. He is extremely smart and charismatic. And he, more than anybody else, represents the intellect. On one occasion, he meets with Father Zosima, and Father Zosima asks him to explain the social theory Ivan has, a social theory that's made Ivan nationally famous. So Ivan elaborates. Ivan says the church should subsume the state, and that ideals of universal Christian brotherhood should be put into every single institution. This way, he says that we won't have to expel criminals as though they were other from us. And he goes on to say that the way that we treat criminals in our society nowadays does not actually deter them, it merely isolates them. So if we replace this with a system of deep inclusion, well, then crime would be reduced. Criminals who are part of this system would not feel like they're stealing from some abstract society. They would feel as if they're taking from the body of Christ himself. The only true way for there to be punishment is for one to be punished by their own conscience. And so we must give society a conscience, Ivan says. And he ends his theory by saying that if there is no immortality, there is no virtue. In short, he puts forward an entirely pro-Christian view of the world. And after hearing this long and well thought out case, Father Zosima pauses and he says, "You are blessed if you believe that, or else you are very unhappy." That's a rather strange thing to say after somebody tells you their intellectual theory, but it hit the nail on the head. Zosima pierced the veil of all of Ivan's intellectual posturing, and he got to the very heart of the matter. Because Zosima himself knows that Ivan does not believe that if there is no immortality, there is no virtue, because Ivan is an atheist. And so by saying all these things, he is lying. And because he is lying, he is unhappy. It turns out Father Zosima is exactly right. This incident happens basically at the start of the book, And over the next 800 pages, we get to see how the distance between Ivan's theoretic beliefs and his actual beliefs and his inability to reconcile them genuinely tears him apart and drives him to madness. So right from the beginning, we are shown how all of this complexity, all of these grand social theories, boil down to the simple distinction between truth and lies. And Zosima teaches us one more vital lesson. He urges us not to look at the external forms, but at the intentions behind them. It's not enough to merely create a system that's going to make you love others or to say you love others. You have to love with all of your insides. And so Ivan is advised to confront his own falsehoods before putting forward any grand theories. But how is it that we can actually do this? How is it that we can overcome shame? We are given two answers on how to overcome shame. The first is faith in what's ultimately right, and the second is through somebody who is unconditionally loving. Essentially, shame dissolves where there is safety. Through faith in what's ultimately right, we are given access to a world where telling the truth is safe, because it is the most important thing, and all else can be forgiven. To Dostoyevsky, such a world is a necessity. He thinks we must live as though every one of our actions has an immortal moral value, and that truth is a vital part of this equation. Recall that triangle from earlier, that vision of paradise? Remember, truth is at the base. This is what Dostoyevsky meant when he said, if there is no immortality, there is no virtue. To him, a world without immortal moral values is one without any moral values. And in this kind of world, we are allowed to tell the truth and let shame wash away in the unending flows of forgiveness. But while we're still on this earth, it helps to have people of the second category. People who are unconditionally loving. Such a person listens to the sound of one's soul over the sound of their words. In the same way that Father Zosima did not pay attention to Ivan's big words, but instead turned his eyes to the heart of Ivan himself, so too do these unconditionally loving people tune in to the sound of the soul. We are shown such a person through Alyosha Karamazov, the third-born son of the brothers and the hero of the book. Alyosha loves other people. He was a monk. At some point he ends up going out into the world because it lets him get even closer contact with people to help them even more so. He always endeavors to follow God's word, and his attitude is nicely summarized here. Quote, "There was something in him that openly expressed that he did not want to judge other people, that he didn't want to render judgment onto anyone, and didn't want to condemn anybody or himself. He seemed to allow anything without the least condemnation." That last line is where the miracle hides. It's that extreme degree of safety that allows other people to dissolve their shame through him. And it's in that sentiment that Dostoyevsky hides his wisdom. This, he says, is the way in which you can be able to face the truth of the world and the truth of yourself. Alyosha listens without judgment. He has no interest in condemnation. It's as though condemnation is a hobby we all engage in all of the time, and it is this continual practice of this that keeps this cycle of shame so perpetuated. And it's through Alyosha that we are shown a way out, because it's this unconditional care he has that allows other people to save themselves. Alyosha hardly gives anybody any advice ever, and yet he helps so many people throughout the book. And it always happens because people simply talk to him and they're able to talk openly, more openly than they've been able to talk to anybody else in their life. And through this, they can begin to see clearly and act in good conscience. And all of this stems from Alyosha's capacity to listen without judgment. And sometimes the things he hears are absolutely horrible. Infidelity, crises of faith, the desire for murder. People have dark desires and deep confusions. And without the kind of incorruptible interest and affection that Alyosha has, it seems as though such dark desires do not have a place. But Alyosha is able to love people through this muck, because what he loves is the divinity within them. And here's the trick. Alyosha's attitude not only works for others, it works for himself, as he himself is a Karamazov, a man who faces the same horrendously dark desires, the same base impulses as the other brothers do throughout the books, the same impulses that leads them to consider murder, leads them to be greedy and horrid. He too possesses all of these. But because he has this attitude, this unconditionally loving attitude, he is able to absolve himself, love himself, and maintain that vision of paradise. And most importantly, he is able to tell the truth. And so we are called not to find people like Alyosha, but to be Alyosha. Okay, we now know that truth is all important because it is a necessary step on the path to paradise. We know that shame, in all of its forms, is what keeps us from it. And now we know how to overcome it. Look, 1, 2, 3, isn't that sweet? Now let's see how Ivan and Alyosha deal with a crisis of faith. The Brothers Karamazov contains one of the most cutting analyses on the nature of the questions of faith carried out in literature, or one of the most famous at least. Now, volumes have been written about the following chapters that we're about to cover, but for our purposes, which is of the importance of honesty, we're going to look at it through the lens of how truthfulness is shown to be the one virtue you can hold to, even when the truth seems heretical. The upcoming chapters are quite dark, so there's a time code here for those who want to skip ahead. This talk takes place between Ivan and Alyosha. Now, Ivan is a sympathetic character. Ivan has a noble soul, and it is because of this noble soul that he states that he cannot possibly believe in God and the world that he has created. And he's explaining this point to Alyosha as they sit together. And in order to make this point, he begins walking through a number of stories that he's collected over the years. All stories which apparently Dostoyevsky himself had seen written about in real life. And all these stories revolve around the unjust torment of children, which to Ivan is indisputable proof that this world here cannot possibly be a part of God's plan. See, for Ivan, he doesn't see how a mother who's just had her child killed before her eyes could possibly be asked to embody Christian ethics of forgiveness and embrace the killer. How could any human be asked to do such a thing? I'm not going to repeat all the stories here. There are so many, and they crescendo in intensity. Each one is worse than the last. But at the height of this drama, at the height of some of the most horrid stuff, Ivan recounts this final note. Ivan's telling a story about a particularly horrid man who likes to torture his serfs. This man has hunting dogs, and one day one of his serfs, an 8-year-old boy, ends up injuring one of these dogs. When the man finds out about this, he sets his dogs upon the boy for sport. And as he's recounting the story, Ivan turns to Alyosha and says, "And Alyosha, what do you think should be done with this man who set his dogs upon this boy?" And Alyosha shouts back, "Shoot him." So Alyosha agrees with Ivan. He seems to commit a heresy. He curses this man. He says to kill him. And it's here that I think a core difference between Alyosha and Ivan begins to sneak in. Alyosha allows himself to be fallen. He allows himself to stick to the truth of what he's feeling. He allows himself to say that you should shoot this person. But he understands that that fallenness is not his primary trait. He is leaning ultimately on faith. On a faith in the truth, by allowing himself to be sinful, by not hiding a single thing about himself, not even the inner wretchedness of his own heart, which might go against the teachings of this faith that he has dedicated his life to. He doesn't disguise any of that from himself. He holds to truthfulness, and by doing this, he preserves a light in his heart that will never go out. Whereas Ivan wants for a world that cannot be, Ivan wants the world to be better than it is, and so he refuses to accept it as it is. And this is a form of a lie. And Dostoyevsky goes even deeper here. He represents this tension so powerfully by the fact that he portrays Ivan, the renowned intellectual atheist, as someone who says that he believes in God. He simply refuses to take part in this world that God has created. He says, I'm returning my ticket. I'm not going to be a part of this wicked plan. Whereas Alyosha, the monk, the faithful, at one point in the book says that he might not even believe in God. Okay, I'm going to stop myself there because I could talk about this forever, but suffice it to say that through and through countless examples in this book, we come to find that honesty and truthfulness is always the right path, even if it doesn't seem quite like that. And it all runs back to those simple distinctions that we made at the beginning, between the love choice and the fear choice, between truth and lies. So long as you allow yourself to know the contents of your own heart, you will never be lost. To make this point even clearer, let's talk about the next part of Alyosha and Ivan's conversation, one of the most famous discussions in literature, called the Grand Inquisitor. Now, I already did a whole video on that over here, so I'm not going to go too far into it this time around, but the gist of the story is that the actual real Christ, like 100% legit Jesus, comes back to life at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. He shows up in this town, and he's arrested by a high-ranking member of the clergy. The high-ranking member of the clergy, the Grand Inquisitor, sees Christ in a cell, says, "I know who you are, and I'm going to kill you." And after he says this, the Grand Inquisitor starts telling Christ about all the things he's going to do to the world. The Grand Inquisitor has a plan to subvert the faith. The Grand Inquisitor outright says he's siding with the devil, and what he's going to do is he's going to remedy Christ's mistake. See, Christ gave freedom to humanity. He says that was a mistake. You shouldn't have given humanity freedom. That's never going to allow them to be happy. Grand Inquisitor has a plan to make them happy. He's going to take some of their freedom away, morally subjugate them, and through that, they're finally going to be able to be free. The Grand Inquisitor commits heresies upon heresies. He's taking away the privileges of divinity that God supposedly gave humanity itself. And after all of this, the Grand Inquisitor just sits there, looking at Christ, waiting for his response. And in response, Christ gets up and wordlessly kisses him. So even the most treacherous betrayals of faith do not defile the Grand Inquisitor enough for him to be irredeemable. Somehow it's suggested that it's still better to be honest even if the contents of your mind are absolutely heretical. There is something deeper and more important than mere words going on here. And what's noteworthy too is that the Grand Inquisitor's motivation was beneficent. He was looking for a way to make humanity happy. But that happiness was based on a certain kind of lie. And so even the most wonderful lie is shown to be ultimately wrong. To me, this really is such a powerful chapter. The way in which Dostoyevsky brings up such hard-hitting questions and tackles them from so many angles with such literary force, and through it all manages to boil all of that complexity down once again to that simple distinction: truth, lies, love, fear. And that is how you can handle shame with grace, or at least something close to it. Let's finally look at the other side of this equation. Let's examine the consequences of dishonesty and shame, and how you can never really get away with it. Following this discussion, our characters go in separate directions, and Ivan, despite his attempts to be a better person, does not quite have the gusto to face the truth of his feeling, and through this he inadvertently encourages the murder of his father. For this to happen, he employs, unknowingly, Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is a whole character. He's actually the fourth born but disowned son of the Karamazovs, and he is a person who's lived a terrible life. He's essentially a servant to Fyodor Karamazov. He's abused and beaten by people constantly, but the thing that really bugs him is that he's always underestimated. See, Smerdyakov is also a representation of the intelligence. He's a very smart person, but he wields it like a weapon. He uses it to belittle people and make fun of them. He uses it to destroy their faith. And when Smerdyakov meets Ivan, Smerdyakov takes Ivan's ideas seriously. Ivan's atheistic ideas that if there is no God, then everything is permitted. And through this, he ends up interpreting Ivan's words and actions such that he thinks that Ivan is telling Smerdyakov to take Fyodor Pavlovich's life. And using all of his intelligence, Smerdyakov does it. Not only does he do it, he does it brilliantly. He does it in such a way that Dmitry Karamazov, the one brother we haven't talking about, the firstborn son, ends up taking all of the blame, and all of the evidence points against Dmitry. Smerdyakov has committed a perfect murder. And in a twisted way, Ivan is an accomplice to this, because Ivan's ideas encourage Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is like a reflection of Ivan. He is this dark, shadow side of the intelligence, a side that's boastful, a side that wants dominion. And I believe this is endorsed by the fact that Ivan is tormented by his own conscience. He is visited by an apparition. He hallucinates a devil. The devil says that he is Ivan himself. The devil begins repeating Ivan's own intellectual points back to him. And Ivan goes through this whole journey, at first trying to adjourn his own responsibility and then coming to believe that I killed him, that I killed my own father. And by contrasting Ivan's initial evasiveness with this pulsating, painful truth, I think Dostoyevsky is showing this idea that you can never, ever get away with it, even when the crime is perfect. And what happens to Smerdyakov? Well, Smerdyakov gets away with it. He commits this murder, and he takes all of this money, this insane amount of money, and he doesn't spend a cent. In fact, what Smerdyakov does, in the midst of the trial, he ends his own life, and he leaves a completely ambiguous suicide note. He doesn't save Dmitry, this person who is unjustly on trial. He doesn't blame somebody else. He simply exits the world. There's some incredible power to the imagery of this modern machination, this modern atheist who takes these quite nihilistic ideas so seriously, commits this act, believes he can get away with it, and then just does it, and then is punished by his own conscience, a conscience he didn't even think he had. There's something so powerful there. It's a theme that recurs throughout others of Dostoyevsky's works as well, like in Crime and Punishment, but let's stop there for now. This is a whole other can of worms, and oh my goodness, I already have one Dostoyevsky video that's over 40 minutes long. This is becoming a bookish video in its own right, so let us move on. So I hope now you can see how we've touched on all of these possible scenarios, that if you're able to tell a lie, you won't get away with it. If you tell a lie indirectly, simply by stating what you believe, if you don't truly believe it, you won't get away with it. And we also see the counter side of this, where telling the truth is difficult, and where even if you tell the truth that seems like the wrong thing to do, it's still the right thing to do. Telling the truth is shown to be of paramount importance, no matter what situation you're in, whether it's a simple kind of situation or a deep crisis of faith. Nonetheless, we are told to hold the truth no matter what. I think the most useful way to bring this into our day-to-day lives boils all the way back to those simple distinctions: love and fear, truth and lies. Additionally, I think something like a Russian diagnosis might be useful, where you can look at your own inner motivations, the things you're doing, the ways that you're approaching life, and question, is this a love choice or a fear choice? Am I living from truth or from lies? Because so much of what constitutes a truth or a lie is subtle and quiet. They are lies like Ivan tells, lies that might sound so nice, lies that we wish were true, things we wish were true about ourselves or others. But at any moment in which you are refusing to see clearly, and in which you are refusing to act in the good conscience brought upon by that seeing clearly, you are doing a disservice to yourself, pulling yourself away from the capacity to attain this kind of paradise. This has certainly been an incredibly powerful book for me to regard in my own life, and I hope one of these lessons has inspired you somehow, perhaps even just to read Brothers Karamazov.